Hello, everybody. Welcome to Art Talk. My name is Molly Cronin, and every month I get to sit down with two esteemed NASCAD alumni and discuss where their careers have led them since their time at NASCAD. And while our NASCAD community is a global one, I hope we've got people tuning in from all over today. Our school, and by extension, these talks are hosted in Chibuktuk and Mi'kma'ki in the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. We are honored to gather, speak, and make artwork here. As I said, my name is Molly Cronin. This week, I'm joined by children's book authors and illustrators Jack Wong and Sydney Smith. Thanks so much for joining us today, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So to get us started, I wanted to bring it back to your time at NASCAD. Could you tell me a little bit about what you were doing at NASCAD, what you were studying, who you were studying with? Maybe Sydney, we'll start with you because I'm looking at you.
Oh, sorry, I keep freezing up.
That's okay.
Did you say start with me? I didn't
Yeah,
catch
that's
that
okay.
part.
Sorry, your face is big on the screen, so I thought I would just take advantage of that. But
I
no
have a big
pressure.
face. It's true.
It's also in chronological order because he's my senior.
True. There you go.
So I started in 1999, and I remember our first day at NASCAD. We were giving these pins that said NASCAD before Y2K. I think I still even have one of them, but I went on to study drawing and printmaking.
Was there anyone in particular you were working
Yeah.
with, like any profs that you remember?
Michael Fernandez, Bob Rogers
Mhm.
was the litho. Ed, oh geez, I can't remember. His last year was my first year of printmaking, but he was the intaglio side. Dan O'Neill, Ed Porter. Yeah, thank you. Dan O'Neill also taught litho and studio, sort of open litho studio, I think, at the time. He was very supportive to me as well. I mean, I received quite a bit of support all around, but I think once it was clear that I was going towards illustration and that sort of avenue, it became sort of obvious that the majority of NASCAD was kind of going in one direction, and I was sort of off in a little bit of another direction, not so conceptual, not so like fine art focused. And so I felt like I was sort of in between. I wasn't design and I wasn't fine art, and so it felt a little bit like a bit of a sort of just floating around, which is fine. I enjoyed that. I enjoyed floating around.
Well, that's great. We're going to talk a little bit in a minute about sort of the trajectory from that period to where you are now. But Jack, I want to turn it to you and hear a little bit about your time at NASCAD as well.
I came to NASCAD to study, in my mind, to study painting. I've been drawing up until the time I went to NASCAD, and never really cracked painting. Like, as someone just trying to learn it from home, I was like, how does this work? This doesn't work. I know how to draw, but I can't paint. So I had this almost notion that I would go to an art school. I almost had this, like, the academy model in it, where I was going to do atelier drawings and paintings, and eventually I was going to be the painter, or a painter. And it didn't turn out that way. But I started off the first couple of years with image making based disciplines, and then by third year, fourth year, I was doing I don't know what you would call it. Molly, you were around the same time, so you might actually know what to call it better than I do. But situational art, installation, performance,
Like
art pranks,
engagement
really.
with the yeah, there was a lot of like participatory or some participatory work I remember around Nocturne, because yeah, you and I graduated the year after you, so we overlapped at NASCAD. Yeah, you seemed like you had a pretty broad practice from my memory. Like, you had your fingers in a lot of different areas from what I can recall.
Yeah.
Does that sound about right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Nice. And who were some of the professors you were working with? Do you remember anyone in particular that
Right,
was
yeah.
influential?
You had you had asked me that question before, and I don't really want to single out anyone in studio because they were all kind of, every studio taught me something. So I thought I would mention the only two writing professors that were, actual writing courses. So I did writing for the arts with Carol Bruneau, and I was really instrumental in almost also someone telling me that I was good at writing again, like because I had notions of wanting to draw and paint, but I'd put away writing since I was probably in elementary school. So so yeah, Carol Bruneau was really instrumental, and then Karen Cope when I did some upper level critical studies and creative / critical writing, that was really instrumental as well. So I'll mention those two.
Well, that's great. We're here to talk about both your authorial practice and your illustration practice. So I think that's a really fitting way to get us into it.
I'm not going to single out any of my studio professors, but I will say that some of them are in the audience, and thank you for tuning in, and well, thank you for everything.
You know who you are, studio profs. So Jack and Sydney, maybe you guys could tell me a little bit about how you came to work in the field of illustration and children's books. Sydney, you talked about sort of finding that feel for illustration while you were in art school. Can you tell us a bit about leaving art school and the kind of steps towards the career that you took?
Yeah, so I felt the I felt kind of drawn to illustrative art before I really realized that it was a thing that I could explore. Or a lot of the art that I was creating when I was in printmaking and drawing was very narrative and had to do a lot with sort of the childhood experience. So it was like it's like my art knew that I wanted to go into children's illustration or picture book illustration before I did, because it was never really offered as a legitimate expression of, artistic expression. It was sort of just never really, for me, my experience, I never really, it was never suggested that it was an option. And then I remember in the NASCAD newspaper, someone had put an ad being like, do looking for an illustrator for a picture book? And so I answered it, and turns out I was the only one who answered it. So that works out. And I did this book. I did this picture book for a publisher that doesn't exist anymore, an author, a local author, and it was a great experience. I don't want to say it was a great book because it was my first one, and I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't really even know the proper steps to laying out a book or any of that. So it just kind of, it was a bit of like baby steps, but making these baby steps in public, and having your books published, and looking at it almost immediately saying, oh, like, what was I doing and what was I thinking? But I mean, it's just, I try not to beat myself up. That's just the way it goes.
Because the learning happens on the ground, right? Like sometimes
Yeah.
we learn best or most efficiently when we are in the thick of it. So
Yeah, exactly.
and after that, how did you progress from there? Did you get attention from that book, or did you have to kind of learn how to pitch from there, or?
Right. Yeah. So I did actually take one illustration course when I was at NASCAD. It was sort of in the design building underneath everything else. Jeff Doms was the instructor. Actually, many people from that class went on to do illustration, which is pretty amazing. But we felt like we were just sort of these misfits kind of meeting in the basement somewhere. And so in that class, they're sort of like introduced to the concept of a portfolio for illustration. So I put that together. And then from then, it's just the books that kind of like promote your work. So every time you put out a new book, it leads the way to the next book. And, as you build up more and more of a library of a history with picture books, it just becomes your portfolio. You don't really have to think about selling yourself so much as, you know, now people start to recognize your work. If you're lucky, you get reviewed, and reviews are always positive, especially with picture books. There's never a really negative review. So it's kind of one of the positives of being in this industry is everybody's like extremely supportive, or you don't hear anything at all. But, you know,
Right.
it's pretty rare that you get, you know, you get dumped on. But yeah, it just builds up from there and gains momentum, and you know, people know of your work and recognize your name, and yeah.
That's great. Nice that there's not a lot of haters in the children's book world.
No, they're probably out there, but they just keep it they just keep it to themselves.
Jack, what about you? What was the transition like, or the development of your illustration practice like from art school to where you are now?
Right. So when I was in art school, I didn't do really anything. I mean, you can always look at it broadly. I was doing image making. I was doing thinking about an image on a 2D surface. So you can always say that there was a connection there, but I wasn't doing anything that was related to children's stories or related to illustration. And at the end of art school, I was feeling a little burnt out, and I think that's very normal. I you know, don't fault the experience for leading to, you know, by the fourth year, not really knowing what to do with art anymore, and took a few years, quote unquote, off from art. I was still interested in many facets. I was helping Matthew Reichert in his studio as a studio assistant, which was an incredible experience because I got all the pleasure of making art without having to, you know, stand behind it, so to speak. Conceptually, I just enjoyed making the work. But I wasn't feeling that connected to making anything for the gallery, anything like that. And it wasn't until well, I should back up for a sec. So you know, around that time, my sister and friends started having kids of their own, or you know, my friend had a niece, and so like little children's book type ideas would pop up, and I'd be pegged as like someone, oh, can you illustrate this? And I was happy to, and playing around with that idea a little bit. And around that time, I started kind of delving into children's books because I always like to do my research. You know, Sydney was saying that, you know, when he jumped in feet first, you know, there were a lot of things that were um, new, and he hadn't figured out all the conventions and everything yet. You know, I had kind of a different experience, and it's largely thanks to creators like him. I've told Sydney, I've told you this before, but around the time I was looking at books like, you know, Town is by the Sea, which had come out in 2018, I believe. Akiko Miyakoshi is another author that I just happened to find at Woozles. And when I did, it turned from being like, okay, I just need to know a couple of things about children's books. It went from that to being, I opened the book and it was really the first moving, impactful aesthetic experience I had since, you know, for years, for a number of years, because I wasn't as connected to the gallery scene anymore. I wasn't seeking out looking at art. So yeah, it was just like having an aesthetic experience in my hands, and for the first time in a long time being really moved, and that's when I thought, well, maybe I should do that. So you know, it sounds like a light bulb moment, but it was just a baby step to another baby step. So it took another few years to really figure out if that was the right path for me. Speaking of NASCAD and what I did learn there, I didn't do illustration the first time around, but I did go back in 2020, I want to say, and did an illustration course with Jeff Baum, and that was really helpful as well. Yeah.
Right. Well, Jack, I'm glad you brought up your the kids in your life, because that was one of the things I was interested in asking both of you, was about whether you have a particular audience in mind when you're writing and drawing these books, if there are children that you know that you're thinking about, or if there's a kind of relationship to you as a kid you're thinking through. Jack, do you still keep some of those little kids you know in mind, or who are you thinking about when you're writing these books?
I've thought about this question a bit, and I actually think that, well, I keep my let's say my nieces in mind, or you know, I've had the pleasure of doing school visits, so I kind of have that moment of you know, kids seeing the book for the first time in mind. But I think that's actually just like the leaping forward to like the ego driven part of it. It's like, oh, you know, when the book gets out there, it's going to be loved by kids and that's going to be so great. I think that's actually different than who I write for. Those are kind of two different questions. I can totally picture them like opening the book and being awed and really liking it and being excited by it. But it's not actually who I write for. I actually don't know who I write for. The stories just kind of come um, and I guess I'm motivated by figuring out how to tell this embryo of an idea of a story, and just the work of doing it itself is kind of what I'm doing. So I don't really think about who it is that I'm writing it for. I did have another version of the answer, which is I write basically for my agent and my editor, because if I can't get them on board, then nothing happens. I think my agent is online today. So hello, hi Wendy. And I mean that facetiously, but I also mean it truthfully, because it's another high bar to meet. You know, editors and my agent, they're people who are passionate about children's books and really know the genre and the medium. So, you know, it is actually an artistic bar to convey myself in a way that I can get them on board with. So it's not, you know, something that I jokingly say. It's actually, you know, at a certain point I do write to be like, you know, how can I get other people on board with this vision I have?
I like that a lot, and I like what Sydney was saying about the audience for children's books is children, but it's also much broader than that. It is the larger literary community, it is the reviewers, it is the people who work towards making these books. So I think that it's great to keep all of that in mind when making these, and your own drive to, as you said, like see where that embryo of the story takes you. Sydney, what about you? Do you think about particular children, or are there particular things that motivate you or audiences you have in mind when you're writing your books and illustrating your books?
Yeah, no. I
No.
mean, yeah, I mean, I could get easily overwhelmed by thinking about all the different people who are, you know, trying to anticipate with their reactions. It can get overwhelming, and you know, you think about teachers, you think about the kids, you think about reviewers, you think about librarians, and you think about parents, and it's all quite a bit much. And yeah, it's always good to have one, if I'm able to like focus it all onto one person, and usually it should be your editor. For me, it's important to have a really good relationship. I felt like I didn't really start taking off until I met this one editor who we just clicked, and I realized, okay, this is what it's supposed to be about. It's about this like sharing of enthusiasm and ideas, and someone who's fostering all of these, you know, these like encouraging you to take risks with your storytelling. And that's always ideal when you can have someone that you can just focus, just like, if I can impress this one person, if I can please this one person, then, you know, everything will be okay. And so that was those are historically have been my editors. But beyond that, who I'm writing for, it's, I guess I have to say that it be for myself, like for not necessarily like who I was when I was a kid, but more because I don't really feel like I'm a different person. And I think there's a lot of you can get into a lot of trouble by having kids as being other than who you are now, and who adults are. There's definitely some big differences in the lives of a young person and an older person, but there's so many universal things that I think is the real you know, the it's gold, picture book gold, I guess you could say. It's those things that are common between children, young young humans and older humans, like the things that concern everyone from the day you're born to the day you die. Like those are the things that I think you don't have to you don't have to separate yourself from that. You don't have to say this is what kids like and this is what kids don't like. And I think that you get into trouble that way, or you limit yourself quite a bit. So draw long long answer is well, I just gave you the long answer. The short answer is I'm I'm writing for the kid that I am still.
I love that. No, I think that all artists, in my opinion anyways, that they make the best work when they remember what it is like to be a child. And I think that it just becomes more apparent in something like literature and illustration for children, because the audience is so marked in that way. But I think all art benefits from that, like you said, remembering that we are still the child that we once were. But thinking about the children that we once were, I wanted to ask you both about if there were books, stories, or illustrators that were influential or memorable to you as children, things that maybe stick with you now, or things that you find yourself returning to in your practice. Were there particular books you loved as a kid that you still really love?
Bit about this, and this is kind of, well, it's not a new thought, but I'm articulating it anew for the first time. That my family immigrated from Hong Kong to Vancouver, where I lived for many years, when I was 6 years old. And I think in that kind of displacement's the wrong word, like just the shuffle. I think I didn't really have much of a strong connection to picture books. I'm pretty sure I kind of missed the whole picture book phase of reading in the midst of doing everything else. And some of the books I remember that I can remember in English, start from Cam Jansen and Encyclopedia Brown onwards. A lot of chapter books and early readers. And as I was thinking about, trying to examine whether that's actually true, I was thinking, I went off on a tangent about how it was interesting being a kid in Canada. This was, 30 years ago or so. And having that dual kind of access to media. Yeah, I'll get to the point. Well, basically, when I was in grade 2, I plagiarized My Neighbor Totoro, the Studio Ghibli film, for like a story writing assignment in my grade 2 class, and I got away with it because nobody knew Totoro yet. So anyways, yeah, so I don't know what to make of that, except I'm coming back to the idea because, often when you ask someone what their kind of childhood reading influences are, I don't actually have that many. And that's because it was during a time that I think there's so much else going on that I don't remember any books that particularly stood out to me. And I'm going to rehash this thing that I drew for another presentation, which is this picture of a book about a Mazda Miata. Because a co-presenter and I were asked this question again of thinking of a book that we remember from our childhood and trying to draw the cover. And he drew something by Beverly Cleary, I think. And for me, all the books I remember are just nonfiction books about Mazdas and baseball and some random thing. And whenever I need a little bit of encouragement as an author, I think about this, because what we do as author illustrators who are serious about our craft is to create the best books we possibly can. So it sits on the shelf and it's available for that kid to pull it from the shelf and read it once and then twice and then fall in love with it and it be their favorite book. That's the part that we control, that the book is on the shelf, but we actually can't control what kids like. And I whenever I need to not think so seriously about all this, I just remember that like my favorite books were just nonfiction books about cars. So I can't really control whether someone likes my book or not.
Well, you seem like such a researcher, so that it's nice to see that stems from a young age too. And that idea of like the book. Like I worked at Woozles for a long time and people would come in and say like, I love this book. It had a red cover. Do you remember it? So that I like that activity of asking you and the other author to
Yeah.
draw the book cover from memory, because often that is the like object memory that we
Yeah.
hold
And
of
I
the
feel
book.
so deficient because all the books they ever mention is like, I've never heard of this, never heard of this.
Oh, all the more to discover now if you feel like doing more research, or you can
Yeah,
read about
exactly.
Mazda you know.
Yeah.
Just you taking a look at your bookshelf behind you, was there anything that stuck out to you?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's anything like there's one here that's this is one that's I've had when I was a kid. It was a book of nursery rhymes, and it, I think the reason why this stuck with me is because a lot of the illustrations are pretty grotesque. Like
Mhm.
I don't know if it was intentionally like that, but it's Marguerite Angeli. I don't know who that is. I mean, I don't know her beyond these illustrations, but it's all just sort of like, I don't know. It doesn't really like, I don't know if you can even make that
Oh
out,
yeah,
but
totally.
it just, there's something a little off about every one of the characters' faces. And there's poems about kids dying in the woods. I think for me, like I was always returning to books that made me feel kind of not, I don't know, just made me feel kind of odd. Like it sort of like evoked something that I was fascinated with, so I go back to it. I remember there was one book that was illustrated. I cannot, I every once in a while I try to find it, but I think it was just a really random book about the safari or something, and then there was a picture of lions eating a giraffe, no, a zebra, sort of like with the hollowed out body of a zebra, and the lions all just sort of gathering around. And I just remember like staring at it for so long, and then like closing the book, putting it back, and then every once in a while taking it out, finding that one page. And um, I think, you know, the picture books have this potential to be a safe place to explore these kind of, or identify some of these things, and just, you know, things that are grotesque, or things that are, you know, a little bit gory, or scary, or um, thrilling. Those are all really great feelings that kids books can explore and be a good safe place to discover those things and identify them. But I don't think I have many other things. I had Edward Gorey was one of my favorite. And actually, when I was in at NASCAD and I was starting printmaking, it was those Gothic illustrators, the Arthur Rackham, or even Edward Gorey, um, those sort of cross hatching and fine pen lines. That was sort of my style at the time. I really liked that a lot. Um, but but yeah, no, to speak on what you had mentioned, like it's always fascinating when people come up to me and they say, "Oh, you gotta you gotta hear about this book that I read when I was a kid, and I read it for my kids, and they love it." And then it's just something I've never heard of before, something that has just it just sort of exists in their world somehow. I don't know how, but it's just like, you know, Teddy Bear Goes to Town or something, you know?
Yeah.
And the reason, and like people don't realize, like the reason why the kids love reading it too is because you love reading it. Like that's the direct connection. It's like I have these books that I loved reading when I was a kid, and I don't think my kids like them, especially for any reason other than the fact that I show excitement and I show enthusiasm, and so it's all sort of passed down. It's this kind of, you know, inheritance from one generation to another of this passion for reading and excitement for picture books. And yeah, I don't know. That's something that's beyond us. You know, Jack and I, we will put together the best thing we can, but all of that magic happens outside of. We just sort of lay the ground for it.
And I think that it's nice to think about the kind of collaborative like uh the way that storytelling and book reading happens for little kids, that there are these moments where they get to read their books alone, like you talked about, Jack, or when you talked about Sydney looking at the particular illustration. There are moments that kids get time alone with books, but there's also a lot of time where the reading is being done by the parent and they're engaging with the illustrations. And and I think kids learn a lot about storytelling and about speaking out loud and about performing through that kind of like shared reading experience. But I was also thinking about the kind of collaborations that you both do because you are both author illustrators, but you have also done the work of illustrating with other authors. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the different kind of projects you've worked on, collaborative versus solo, how you navigate those collaborations, etc. Maybe Jack, you've been working independently, I think, up until now, but you've got a collaborative book coming up. Am I correct
Hmm.
in
Yeah,
that?
I have a book now has a title. I don't know if
Oh,
it's
congrats.
I don't know if I can say it yet. It's a picture book biography on the cellist Yo-Yo Ma, written by James Howe, and published by Abrams. And yeah, I am illustrating that book right now. And yeah, it's a really wonderful, very different experience in working on your own book. One of the things that only happened when I did this project, which is my fourth go around of doing a book from start to finish. In picture books, there is, or sorry, I should say in illustration in general, there is this notion of a gap between the illustration and what it's illustrating, in this case words. And it's it can be called just a gap. I read the term décollage, which is a French term for some, can't remember what, it's probably just a gap. Anyways, it's something that really speaks to me. The French word sounds more eloquent. But yeah, so if the words are saying something, your images are complementary, but not necessarily just illustrating what the words say. A kid with a red jacket goes to school. It's not just a picture of a kid with a red jacket going to school. And this is often the success of doing this is often associated with author illustrators. And yet, for my first couple of books, I actually didn't really crack the nut of how to incorporate décollage in my books. I was so I think it's often successful with author illustrators because they can plan that half the story is conveyed by words and half the story is conveyed by pictures, and they get to control both sides of that. And for me, as someone who is new to this, I hadn't cracked the code on how I can do that. And it wasn't until I was illustrating this book for James and doing this Yo-Yo Ma book that I actually started feeling like the words say one thing, but I want to draw this other thing. And it's almost like I needed that productive tension. I wouldn't call it adversarial because James wrote a beautiful text and it's great, and it's for all the things it has to achieve. But there's this kind of tension where I'm actively struggling against the text now. I'm not just the person who generated both of those parts. There's this text and I'm struggling with how to illustrate it my way. And it wasn't until illustrating for someone else that I figured out, this little bits of this idea of wedging a gap between the images and the words, which I'm not sure is how that usually works. You often see, again, author illustrator projects that have this really beautiful beginning to end play with word and image. Whether it's just in certain scenes or in a book like Sydney's, again, with Small in the City, where there's this whole throughout the book play with expectations of the words, perhaps describing a boy that's small in the city, and it ends up being about a cat. And it's not so simple as the words aren't saying what's on the page, but there's this extended metaphor, or in this case, extended gap between the words and the pictures. So I don't know how if that's how it usually works, that people, author illustrators, find their way with this concept through their own projects first. But for me, I never really cracked it until I illustrated for someone else.
Yeah, and maybe having the kind of boundaries of someone else's writing or the kind of like roadblocks in a way is helpful because it gives you something to push against. So it's like you said, a challenging tension, I think is an interesting challenge to be given in a
Mhm.
project,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It also is a
Cindy-
book about a
Oh, sorry,
cello,
go
so like I can either just draw some guy playing the cello for 32 pages, or I can try to find my own visual story through it. So that was perhaps another reason why that project was so primed for me to find my way with this concept.
Nice. Thanks, Jack. Sydney, can you tell us a little bit about your relationship to collaboration and your work as an author illustrator?
Yeah, I've had some great experiences, and usually it's I mean, a lot of people like to say that author and illustrators work separately, you know, like the text is finished and it's passed on to the illustrator. But I don't know if that's true. But for me, I've always gotten in touch with the author, and always I've always wanted to make sure that everyone is sort of, you know, on the same path. We all have the same sort of goal, which is to create the most, you know, dynamic, beautiful thing that we can, and always serving the story, always doing, you know, everything is in service of the story and the reader, and making it making it an experience, and a lot of times a very active experience. And so to activate, you know, that the reader, you have to challenge them a little bit. And so, like Jack was saying, you kind of, you don't have this sort of redundant image text thing happening in the books. You the illustration is there to elevate the text, or to you can even change the way that the text is read. Uh, and in that in that sort of situation, the illustrator can have ultimate power over the storytelling, because you can completely change the way that that words are heard, which is pretty amazing. You know, it's an incredible power. And when you think about it, you know, if you're shown one thing, and you, or you're told one thing, everything's fine, for example, and you see something completely different, that like nothing is fine, everything's falling apart, everything's broken, everything's, but you hear the words and you see something completely opposite, that as a reader you don't trust the words, you trust the image. The image is that has the ultimate last say over everything. And so as an illustrator, I mean, you don't want it to go to your head or anything, but it's a lot. It's quite a bit of power to control the way that the words are received, the way that the story is understood, or the character. I mean, you can add so much more dimension to the character by what you show and don't show. But for in terms of like working with other people's texts, it's always a great. I always find it really rewarding, because you come up with these answers that you wouldn't have come up with on your own. You would come up with these sort of the resulting book, and the images and the combination. Those things happen because of these different influences. You know, you have the words, you have the images, and then you have the aggregate, which is the, you know, the result of the collaboration. And you can sit by yourself and you can write words and you can draw images, and it can also be quite rewarding, but it can also be a lot of feedback, and you could end up like looking at your own words and looking at your own images and hearing your own voice, and you start hating your own voice, and then you start, you know, for me it's a lot more difficult to write and illustrate at the same time. But you are given an opportunity to explore things further, explore things that you wouldn't normally if you were illustrating to someone else's text. Like with Small in the City, the book that Jack had referenced, the goal for that book, which was my first book that I wrote, was to write something that you could not understand just through the text, or you could not understand just through the image, that you had to have both of them to kind of have an informed understanding of the situation. And the emotional state of the character and what they were doing, why they were, who they were talking to, all of these things. That was sort of like, that was the goal at the beginning of the story. And I think a lot of times you will not have that opportunity if you're illustrating someone else's text, because a lot of times that text is finished by the time it gets to you, or at least not necessarily finished, but it feels like a package. It feels like everything's explained, everything, there's a lot of times there's quite visual language as well, which is another issue. And like all of a sudden, as an illustrator, your job is like being done for you. It's like, stop describing everything with such visual language. What am I going to do? I mean, that's it's an opportunity to do something completely different too. So I don't know. There's so many different exciting ways to work, and it's just not one isn't better than the other, I guess.
I think what you're saying about there sometimes being dissonance or a change between the text and the image is really interesting, because I think coming back to kids reading with parents is that the text is being read by the parent and the child is watching the images. And if the images can deviate, then the kid kind of gets to be the authority and say like, well, something else is going on in this picture that I'm looking at really closely and that I'm really absorbing. And so I think the illustrator has a lot of like ability to connect with the child as like a visual learner in that moment, which is, I think, a really interesting, but I digress. I get
No, I think it's really important to consider that as, someone who is creating this book, is that you are given this extreme privilege of being involved, being welcomed, invited into this very intimate space of a parent or an older adult, a reader reading to someone who's younger. Like there's this, it's just like it's a gesture of love between two people, of like it's intimacy between two people, and you are there involved in it, a very active part of it. It's like part of the dynamic of this incredibly beautiful thing.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Sydney. Jack, is any of that resonating with you? You write about like in one book you write about like an intimate relationship or like a family relationship in particular. So I was wondering if any of this is kind of ringing true for you as an author illustrator, what we're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. What I was thinking about as Sydney was talking about that is more broadly just the presence of adult figures, your child's grown-ups, in both the reading experience and both in the story itself. One of the themes that I like to play with a lot in my stories, I mean, I try to not have a through line through everything, so that they're all its own thing. But an idea I keep coming back to is that the experience of being a child is actually being one of agency less. Like there's a lot of books, and I appreciate that they're out there that are about, this is me, I'm powerful, I can do anything, and there's a place for those books. But for me, the thing that I'm most interested in is that, kids don't actually have that much agency. There's a lot of stuff that happens to them. They don't get to control it, but they get to control, or they get to experience through story how children can respond to those situations or make sense of those situations. So yeah, again, here's an example. This for my first book, When You Can Swim, it's about all the places you can go swimming. Oh shoot, this is the one with all the kids signing, so it's all marked up. So there's an adult presence throughout the book, and it gets to this line. So this is a father or a grown-up diving with a kid. So each page happens like that. And the refrain is, when you can swim, we can do this. When you can swim, you can do this. And it gets to here, it says, when you can swim, I'll take you there. And when this was going through some personal editing and sending it out for critiques and that kind of stuff, I got more than once the suggestion that instead of when you can swim, I'll take you there. It should be when you can swim, these are the places you can go, or when you can swim, these are the things you can do. And it was this notion of removing this dependency on an adult telling a kid, I'll take you there. It seemed to the person who gave me the critique a little too prescribed or too kind of projected from a grown-up down to the kid. And for me, it's just like, what kid doesn't want their grown-up to take them places, and in a larger sense, be embraced by, like, have a warm hug from an adult that they love. So there's a lot of good sense in removing some aspects of adult interference in a child's story, but the part where they're just showing that they're there is something that I think it's pervasive in the reading experience anyway. As you were saying, and as Sydney was saying, they're reading the story with the kid, to the kid, that there's really I don't really feel like there's the need to remove, adult care and love and helping you with your agency less in the book. So, I mean, with Sydney's most recent book, it would be a totally different story. I don't know if anyone's read this. I'm sure you all have. Do you remember? Amazing book.
Thank you.
And it's about it's about they have to move, and the kid is agencyless because he didn't decide that they were going to move. Probably he didn't decide where they were going to go. These are all the things that are happening to him, and he decides with his grown-up that they're going to make memories together, and it ends with a similar similar sentiment where the parent and the child agrees to make a memory together. And the book would be very different. It was just like the kid saying, I'm going to make this a memory. It's the collaboration or the intimate, the fact that the child has an idea and the mom loves it. That's part of, the reading experience, and that's part of the children's story experience too. So yeah, I think I focus on a lot about child agency less, because I think all the stories I can remember about as a kid is like, I wanted to drive and I had to wait like how many ever years, and I was put into baseball even though I didn't like baseball, and all the things that happened to me. I mean, I immigrated from Hong Kong to Vancouver. I don't think I asked for it. So and it's about what happens in spite of those things that you can't control. And I think Sydney's stories, both the ones that he's written and the one he's illustrated, speak beautifully to that experience in every case.
Thank you. Yeah, just to like add on to what you were saying, I think that something that moves me that is present in your book that you just showed is this sort of idea behind the fact that we as authors are putting words into the mouths of the reader. So in the situation where you have an older person reading to a younger person, let's assume that they have this relationship that's very, very close relationship, maybe familial even. And you are giving these words, you're loaning these words to the reader to use them, to put them with their voice. They are saying these words. And if these words are things like something that the child has been waiting or dying to hear, or just needed to hear it in those specific words, that just in that way is so amazing, incredible. And a lot of times, yeah, I guess I do have a through line with a lot of my books, because I end up always trying to say, everything's going to be fine. Don't worry. Because that's all I've ever wanted to hear when I was a young person. And it's all I want to tell my own children is it's going to be okay, no matter what. And yeah, I think it's a pretty powerful thing to remind ourselves that that we are part of this interaction, this very special interaction between these people.
I think that's wonderful. Thank you both.
Yeah,
I
as
wanted,
I was
oh
thinking
yeah,
one more thing,
go
as
for
I
it.
was saying how, kids are marked by the fact that they don't really have any say over or agency over their stuff. And then Sydney was saying before that he doesn't differentiate between, the child version of himself and himself. I guess I'm just saying that we're all pretty much, floating around, not having any say in what we do, which actually does ring true. So we're all
Yeah.
so it's consistent. It's internally consistent logic that that's still the stuff we deal with. Things happen to us as adults too, and that's why perhaps those stories, either when we pick up one of my books or Sydney's books, it either speaks to the child in them or just speaks to them. Period.
Hmm. I
Yeah,
think so.
yeah.
I like to think so.
Wonderful. I want to open it up to the chat now. If anybody in the audience has a question for Jack and Sydney, and you want to either turn your video on or pop a question in the chat and I can read it out. We've got a few minutes to do that.
Hi, I am a huge fan of your work, Sydney, and I have used I Talk Like a River as a speech language pathologist now, having gone to NASCAD at the same time you did.
Oh,
And
amazing.
the rhythm of it, the pacing of it, I'm just wondering about that collaboration because I felt like it was so useful with children who have had the experience of stuttering to have so many pauses in that book and room for them to see themselves and interact. So, but I really felt like that came, I assume it came from both of you. So maybe just some help with understanding that collaboration of putting that timing and that spacing, and especially the pictures later on where they're, sorry, I'm rambling in my question, but I use a lot of wordless picture books.
Yeah.
And I found that book to be a really beautiful combination of words and wordless to create rhythm.
Thank you. I Talk Like a River was written by Jordan Scott, who's remains a very good. I was just chatting with him seconds before signing in today, and we're talking about writing more. And he's an incredible author, but also it's very autobiographical. He grew up still living with disfluency. Is that I don't correct me if I use any terms wrong. Um, and I Talk Like River was directly about his experience growing up and feeling at odds with his own body and his mind and all of these things that he felt really separated from that. Really, really beautiful stuff. Gave me an opportunity to get really expressionistic, kind of really playing a lot, trying to capture the feeling of it without it being too visual and too cliche. And thanks to Jordan for that. Like he really he helped me with that quite a bit as well. And of course, our editor Neil Porter, with the with the pacing of the picture book, it's really important for me to know to sort of anticipate when certain emotions are certain moments of emotional impact. So you don't want to squeeze too much into one page, one spread. You don't want you want to really kind of like evenly distribute all of those sort of moments, all of those points. And especially it's become sort of the thing that I do quite a bit is if there is a big emotional impact, like the point in the movie, in the book where it's this moment of catharsis. There's this double gape fold where you see the character wading out into the river, and it's supposed to represent this very cathartic moment. I speak like a river, or I talk like a river, is what it says, and it's really beautiful. And it's that needed to have a moment, and it needs to have a lot of rest around it as well, for the reader to feel and process the significance and the weight of this moment. And so I try to think a lot about how the reader feels when I'm pacing things out, and try not to rush them through a lot of things. Like if it's something, especially if something is suggested and not really you're not told how to feel, but you're suggested how to feel. A lot of times a moment of silence in the text, you give a beat of just wordless images, then you can really like give the give the reader this a second to just kind of process it, you know. And I love giving the reader some time to just kind of put these things together. It's not just a feeling as well, you know, when things need to speed up and when things need to slow down, when it needs to be, when things need to sort of hang there in the air, and you just sort of have to listen to it resonate, kind of.
A couple in the chat, to the point where maybe I'll just tell you what some of them are, and you guys can choose. We've got an inundation. So we've got a question about wordless books, if that might be an interest to either of you. We've got a question about balancing words and text and how to kind of not over illustrate or overwrite, and kind of knowing when you're finished, knowing when they're compatible, and knowing when to like put the materials down. And maybe a question about the material process. So Jack, maybe I'll turn to you. Do you have anything to say about either wordless picture books or about knowing how to balance the writing and the text, or about the process? Sorry, that's like 3 questions, but dealer's choice, or sorry, illustrator, author's choice.
Okay, let's see which one I can tackle. I know a lot of people are interested in, you know, the nuts and bolts of illustrating itself. So I can speak to that, especially since yeah, I can share a little bit that's, you know, my ties, what we've been talking about together. So, you know, often the question is something like, what's your medium, whether it's digital or analog, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the more interesting questions that I've found kind of trumps those is, how long do you want to spend on a drawing? And I don't mean that just in like, you know, like that's another question that I asked, how long did it take you to do a book? How long did it take you to draw this picture? It's about the process of whether you want to iterate or whether you want to, you know, draw a picture. If you look at some of the conventional ways of illustrating, because it is its own discipline, you know, there's a lot of factors, like you have to do work fast, you have to meet a brief so that you're hitting a lot of marks about what the image should do. A lot of the conventional stuff is about scanning and tracing and locking in an image, and then you color over it, and you kind of think of those 2 steps as kind of separate. And I started with a fair bit of that. And one time I was asking, again, Matthew Reichertz, I was asking him, you know, there's this drawing that I was already starting to illustrate, and I was still his studio assistant. So I got a chance to pick his brain or just kind of run things by him, even though he wasn't an illustrator. And I said, you know, like, I can't get this picture right, you know, do you have any practical advice for how to do it? And he just said, well, I guess you just have to draw it again until it works. And I was like, okay. And as I was kind of researching illustrating, you know, again, Sydney's work, there's a lot of it that you can see of his process online. And one of the things you can see is that he works kind of, at least for some of your books, I know your Santa book is on at a full scale, but a lot of them are smaller scale and they're iterative. So for Small in the City, for example, you know, I've seen a spread of the cover image or one of the window reflections that were hard for you to do, and there's just like 8 of them, and they're these little small pieces.
No, right.
Yeah. And it's about, and it kind of disabused me of these ideas that there's freshness to be found if you only do it once, or you have to like kind of line up all your ducks in a row and then execute, and that's the only way to keep freshness in the picture. And you know, and that's one way of doing it, you know, to kind of put all your eggs in one basket and try to sit yourself down with everything planned out and everything, and then that may be the opportunity to execute and make it fresh because you're all planned out. And another way of doing it is to do it, you know, a little, each image or each iteration obviously can't take, you know, 2 days to finish, because you'll never be able to do 8 versions of it. But, you know, drawing iteratively, and one out of those 8 versions is the one that's going to go in the book. And none of them are ever perfect. You know,
Can I interrupt you there for a second?
Yeah.
One of the things that I've done before, which can help if you're feeling like really, I think it was for Town is by the Sea. I would sometimes do 2 paintings at once.
Yeah.
So you have 2 pieces of paper, same dimensions. You do one wash here, you do the same wash over here. You do and the next layer, and then that works. You do the next layer there, and then you keep on doing that until the first one you mess up, and you're like, oh, okay. So you have another one right there that you can just continue without repeating the thing that you didn't like.
Yeah.
That could be something.
In any case, I should try that.
Yeah.
But deciding whether you want to kind of have the process of kind of one-shot deal or iterative or something in between, or something that's not even one of those options, that kind of informs your medium decisions. That kind of informs your style, and whether it's going to be loose or whether it's going to be detailed. It informs a lot. Just if you're saying, do I want to sit down and just like have one shot at this, or do I want to iteratively approach an image? And neither of them are better than the other, but it answered for me a lot of questions about what medium am I working in, whether it's digital. Like, so there's sometimes these root questions that are actually under the questions that we think are the questions.
Sydney, do you want to close us off with anything about process or materials and your relationship to them in your practice?
Well, for me, I think that it's always been important to always just be trying out something new, or for the longest time, I thought that building up a style was really important, which I mean, a lot of people, I guess, would consider that to be important, but style is sometimes a thing that it just sort of happens. You can try to be intentional with it, but I think you can get into a lot more trouble that way. Eventually something comes out. So like people will recognize your work and they'll call it your style, but it really is just you know, it's what you project into your artwork. It's the heart that you put into your artwork. It's the amount of time that you spent, the amount of like hours you are thinking about it. It all gets projected into that artwork, and people will recognize it for for being yours. And it does not mean that you have to stay with the same brand of pen, or that you have to like use the same paints or the same paper or any of that. And I think that as soon as you feel comfortable with all of those things, you need to start breaking some of those rules. And a lot of it is rules that you've made for no reason whatsoever, just because you thought that you shouldn't make a change here or there. You should always be consistent. But I think that for me, it's more exciting to be inconsistent, or at least to be constantly trying to challenge myself in areas that I'm not confident in, and the energy that comes from that, of taking risks and not knowing if it's going to be okay, but just taking a risk. That's the success. That's what my definition of success is like I've tried something I haven't seen before, and who knows if it's going to work or not, but I did it anyway. And that's what inspires me, I think, and hopefully maybe other people.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, both of you. It was such a treat to talk to you. Everyone watching, you can buy Jack and Sydney's books wherever books are sold. I recommend in particular Woozles in Halifax if you're local. And thank you both again so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, thanks, Sydney.